Okay. Hi. Well, we're so glad that this is our practical guides to being human, because we're feeling pretty human right now. But
Yes.
we're awfully glad to be here and be sharing this time with you. We appreciate you joining us because we have so much that we want to talk about with you.
Yes.
So, so who is this for? We're
Mhm.
glad you're here, but we want to tell you who we've designed this for. That we've spent years and years working on our own relationship and helping other people work on theirs and improve it. And what we felt more and more like doing over these last few years is finding a way to let more people know about it and to make it accessible for people who can't afford coming into therapy or want to do more work on their own.
Mhm.
Which is where a lot of it is. As therapists, we always say to people, we consider our job making ourselves obsolete.
Yes.
So that we want to
Not
do that
completely
more and more.
Not completely absolute.
Not completely absolute. But so this is for people who are serious about working on their relationship. If you are experiencing struggle and confusion over having toxic fights with the person that you're closest to. You love them, the relationship feels important, but you keep encountering these, we call them activations, that do damage. Conflict doesn't do damage. Conflict is an inevitable part of everyday life. But what's not inevitable is having that conflict turn into a toxic fight.
When there's lots of damage being done, and things are said and done that you can't undo, and
Right.
they leave that residue.
Right. And in one of those fights, we see each other as cardboard cutouts of each other, not the real person. So that's who this webinar is for. Or if you're interested just in finding out more about our process and who we are and what we have to offer, we're glad you're here.
Right, because when we're doing all the, we're doing sessions and we're doing work with ourselves, and also what we've written and all the sort of the things that we do that are sort of engaging with these concepts and tools, we want to make it in a form that is easy to sort of say, now, what was that?
Right.
How does that? So it's like, because there's so much, but to kind of put it in a form that's kind of easy to take in and remember and then really internalize and use.
Yeah, so that's why we call them practical guides. And so we're going to launch right in and start telling you about 3 ways that we've culled from our inventory of tools and techniques, 3 ways to stop a toxic fight. And so Greta's going to start with the first one.
Well, the first one is the concept that sort of really is the foundation for everything else, which is the idea, which seems maybe obvious, but that everybody's in their own movie, that we are in our own reality all the time. And this is sort of an inconvenient thing to really be aware of, because it just is sort of complicated to think of everybody sort of experiencing things, taking it in through their own associations, taking it in through their own ways that their brain actually brings in information, and then having it go through the filter of their experiences, their cultural biases. So we realize that this sort of concept of, wow, you're really experiencing this moment, this webinar, quite differently than I'm experiencing this webinar, right? And all of you are experiencing it differently too. And to really understand that in a visceral, rational, emotional way sort of leads to the kind of compassionate curiosity that we suggest is the way you sort of go towards, you know, discussions and conflicts and negotiations,
Yeah.
because that allows for sort of both people to share what's going on, and then you can really work on negotiating something that feels better.
Right. So we've decided to be vulnerable ourselves,
Yes.
because this is vulnerable work, right? It's not just easy to do. It really requires a person to stop doing the easy thing, which is to blame somebody else, and to take responsibility for actions and reactions. So we're going to use an example from our own lives.
Yes.
of a time that we had very different movies. So here's my movie. We had been camping, and we saw the forecast, which was torrential rain. So we decided to pull up stakes and head for Montreal, which was not that far away. It was several hours drive, but it seemed doable until it started pouring. And
torrentially.
Yeah, just like the forecast said. They were right this time. So it was a very difficult drive, driving into a major city, which had signage in French, finding a hotel we'd never been to before that we booked at the last minute. But we navigated it, and we got there, and we got into the hotel, sat down. It was supper time by now. We were both hungry. And so I found the little booklet that the hotel provided for recommended restaurants. And I was thinking, Montreal is a cosmopolitan city. It's a great place for food. I bet we could find something that's nearby, because it's still raining, and something good to eat. So I looked down the list, and there was a restaurant that had high ratings, and it was nearby, and it was Indian food, which I like. So I turned to Greta and I said, hey, we could go to this Indian restaurant. So that's where I'm going to stop my movie.
Well, but it's very interesting, because in doing this course, how we were remembering the whole situation.
We were in different movies.
And we got slightly activated because we got, no, that's not what happened. Which just goes to show how different our movies are. So Bill said Indian food, and I, from my movie, said, what? Indian food? You know, why would you choose Indian food? Bill heard that as, no, we're not going to Indian food.
But what was your movie coming up to that point?
Oh, my movie coming up to that point was that I was really, really hard driving, and I was very exhausted. But I started thinking, oh, we're not camping, but we're going to Montreal. And Montreal is this French city. It's sort of, you know, I think of it as the poor person's Paris, which they might not like that, but it was like, if you can't go to Paris, you go to Montreal. And I'd only been there once when I was very young with my parents. And so I was going, oh, this romantic city that's going to, you know, we can have this lovely, sophisticated French meal and be all sort of, you know, urban and get gussied up. And so when Bill said Indian food around the block, it was like, what? We get takeout Indian food all the time, which of course we don't get it all the time, but we get it a lot. So I got upset.
Yeah, and so did I. Because what I heard was, why on earth would you want to get Indian food in Montreal? And I had my own reasons, but Greta had hers. And so we had a big activation, and we went back and forth for a while.
Yes. And then we called a pause.
We called a pause.
Which was very useful, right? we said, I think I went and took a shower. We calmed down.
That's right.
And then we were sort of able to talk about what was going on. And Bill was saying, hey, that felt really sort of, shaming and ridiculing and sarcastic. And that didn't feel good that you didn't even consider my idea.
Right.
And I heard that.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And then you told me about your earlier associations.
Yeah, well, I explained why it was so important for me to go to a French restaurant, that it was Montreal and I was wanting to get dressed up and I was wanting, it was like our one night in a city that would probably have good French food,
yeah.
which we didn't really have that much opportunity to have where we were in our neighborhood.
Yeah, New York is really, doesn't have very many French restaurants.
It's my idea, right? I was fixated on it.
So, yeah, so there we have, what helped in that situation was to be able to talk about our two movies, to realize we came at this situation with very different expectations and different movies going in our head. And when those movies collided,
they collided,
there was a big boom.
Right.
But as soon as we kind of realized that it wasn't the thought of one or the other that was the important thing, it was the disconnect or the way that we were expecting the evening to play out, that was the problem. And once we figured that out, then that helped us to calm down and enjoy the evening.
Well, because one of the things that we did when we went to the restaurant and we were actually enjoying the French food and the candlelight, I was able to remember that I had a very traumatic experience when I'd gone to Montreal the first time, because my memory is that we went as, when I was with my parents and I was about 8 years old and I had very younger brothers, and we went to a fancy French restaurant, which we never went to restaurants much when I was a kid. So this is like a big deal. And my brothers were being completely impossible. I mean, they were about like 1 and 2 years old, or 2 and 3. And so my parents said, Greta, you go outside and amuse the boys while we enjoy this lovely French restaurant. And I had this memory of like looking at them and saying, oh, I want to be in a French restaurant in Montreal. And I didn't remember that until we were sort of in the restaurant and sort of relaxed. And I was really kind of acknowledging that it was very hard for you to drive.
So, that's like the music in the movie, right? The soundtrack is this sad, wishing it could be different.
And you remembered how your parents said your older siblings had not kind of been very, they would sort of jump on you and say, that's a ridiculous idea. So that was kind of how.
It wasn't the first time I'd heard it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what we want to do now is to talk. So that's the first way that you can actually intervene when activation starts to build up, is to say, what's your movie?
Right. Yeah, be really curious, compassionately curious about what's going on in the other movie.
I think we're in different movies.
And to sort of then realize what movie you're in and what are the associations. So that's the first way.
Right. So the second way we want to talk about is a concept that in between an action and a person's reaction is the interpretation of the action. In physics, we think about every action has an equal and opposite reaction. You hit the billiard ball with a cue, the ball takes off. There's not too much interpretation going on there. But when it's humans, it's not action-reaction. In between the action and the reaction is interpretation. So that's what we want to talk about next. And you see in the illustration here, the one critter, these are our star critters.
Yes.
And the one is bringing flowers to the other one. And she says, oh, she's touched. He brought me flowers.
How lovely. Means you love me.
That's one interpretation. Yes, it means he loves me. That's so nice. In the second iteration, She looks at the flowers, sees that they're daisies, and says, "Daisies are so cheap. You must not think very much of me. You just spent $3.50.
Got them at the grocery store on your way here."
And then that's a second interpretation. Daisies are cheap, so you must not value our relationship very much.
Right.
The third one, he's bringing flowers, same earnest star critter bringing flowers. And this time it brings up a memory of, oh, when I was growing up, what I remembered was Dad always brought Mom flowers after a bad fight. That's how they made up. So when I get flowers, I'm just taken back into that awful time where the shouts and screams and pots and pans are still echoing in my ear.
Right. Yes.
So what about, I guess, so the interpretation, using our same example, was when I heard Greta say, well, that's a ridiculous idea to get French food, to get Indian food in Montreal, I thought, well, that's being sarcastic and dismissive. You know, that's how I interpreted that remark. And what we talk about sticky beliefs. Sticky beliefs are beliefs that we've had a long, long time, and a lot of things that we experience, we turn into evidence to support them. So my sticky belief around this was that my opinions don't count. And so here is more evidence for the file that what I wanted, what I was suggesting, wasn't valued, it was being dismissed out of hand. So when I interpreted Greta's action that way, I had a reaction.
Right.
Which was angry.
Yes. And that's when sticky beliefs get involved, then you can feel the energy rise, because it's something that brings us into our defensive mode. It brings us into our bodyguards come out.
Right.
So this is an old thing. My thoughts and feelings don't matter. And it kind of has the whole weight of all the times that's ever happened, right? So mine was, oh, I can't say anything to disagree with your reality, what you want to do. So if, kind of a similar version, but it was sort of like, I can't disagree. I just have to shut up and be quiet and go along with what you want. And that sticky belief of just like, yep, just go along, just comply, just, was something that felt very heavy for me. But and I didn't like it. And I got my bodyguard came out. So when you get the two bodyguards interacting, it's not, you kind of lose your ability to think rationally, and sort of compassionately and curious, have curiosity about what's going on and what's the other person, because it just goes into that primitive brain. So that's why it's really important to be aware of what the interpretation is. Right. And if that interpretation is pushing a button of a sticky belief, right, that really kind of sort of adds gusto to
right.
what's no longer a dialogue, right?
So how would you suggest using that? How can people use this concept?
Well, I mean, one of the big things is to actually do some work and understand what your sticky beliefs are, so that when you feel yourself going, oh, you go, okay, especially if we're saying always and never or something like that I am probably in the grip of one of those sticky beliefs. So you want to be curious, say, what's my movie and what is the interpretation? Right. This is the action and this is my reaction, but I want to know what the interpretation, and is there another possible interpretation, right? I want to ask that question. One, I want to be curious about what your interpretation is, but I also want to understand what other possible interpretations that I could come up with in my own kind of reality, my own movie, that would be more useful. Right.
So when we encounter something that feels really activating, an activating event, to be able to stop and say, how interpreting this? Is there some interpretation going on here? There always is. So the answer to that question is yes. Next question is, what is my interpretation and what's it based on? So that's a second way that we can use to stop a toxic fight. Before it, we say before it starts, well, what we mean is before it really explodes into something devastating and really damaging.
Right. I mean, we could feel the activation, so use the pause, and then being able to sort of talk about our interpretations. And then there can be lots of layers. It was sort of like, there was the first layer that got us to the restaurant, and then there was the next layer in the restaurant. And then there was actually, I remember talking about it in the drive later, and then we actually talked about it kind of later when I was sort of writing about it, and then when we were doing this. And each time we actually understood more and more about one, each other, right? And two, ourselves. And that is gold. I mean, that is what really changes our relationship.
Right? Yeah. So as you can see, we're very excited about all this, and we have more to say than can be said in this time. We're taking an hour today. Right. So that brings us to something we want to share with you today that we're also very excited about. We've been on a process in this last year. Gretta's been writing years, yeah. But in this past year, we've kind of been pulling into fruition a lot of our hopes and plans around these things. And we've done some live talks, and this is our first webinar.
Yes.
And what we're building is a repository for these tools and concepts that we want to share with lots of people. So we want to tell you about what we're doing and what's available besides this webinar. And that is a course. We're teaching an 8-week live course on the Teachable platform, which is a beautiful, easy to use site. And we've set up our first course that we're calling Stop Having the Same Old Fight. That same old fight. And with the subtitle, and get what you really want instead.
And we have a great IT guy named Bill, who has been able to sort of delve into, hours and hours of YouTube videos and things that are showing how to do all this and do all that, and the fabulous illustrations. And
So yeah, I've been doing illustrations for the book, and we're using them more and more. And what this 8-week course is an in-depth look. There'll be 8 weeks talking about using this tool we call HookSnap. We developed it through working with our own conflicts and then taking these concepts and using them with our clients. And we've developed this kind of comprehensive tool to look at conflicts, to take them apart, understand why they happened, get insight to your own contribution to it, and serve as a way to talk with each other. So here's what it says: a tool to help you understand what the fight was really about. How many times we have the same old fight that it starts out about a discussion about, the groceries, and ends up in a nuclear reaction that leaves us dazed and damaged.
And for days sometimes.
Yeah, and it always seems to spiral back to the same old things. Why is that? Think sticky beliefs.
Right.
But there's a whole lot more to unpack around that. So it's 8 weeks long.
With this great metaphor.
Yeah, this great metaphor of you being the fish swimming along happily through the ocean until you see a hook. Well, you don't see the hook. You see bait on the hook. It looks juicy and yummy, and you grab it. And then you're struggling on the end of a hook. That's what it feels like to us to be in one of these toxic fights.
Hooks don't feel good.
No.
And they're sort of hard to get off sometimes.
Yeah, they stick.
Right.
So each week we're going to cover one of these topics that you see on the right-hand side: conditions, the bait, the hook, the struggle, true food. These are looking at what went into making the same old fight.
Mm-hmm.
And then we spend also time understanding and practicing what you might do to avoid that same old fight. And these things that we're talking about today, and these 3 ways to stop a toxic fight, are ideas that are included among many other ones.
Right, because we'll be going really in depth, and we'll be doing things like assignments and doing really constructive things, and have fillable forms that they can actually work and interact with, and they can do questions that say, well, but I don't understand that, and but what about this kind of a situation? It wouldn't work for that. So we'll be able to sort of say, okay, we're interacting, with after we present the ideas with real questions and real sort of situations, and being able to give assignments that help to integrate, to really make it your own.
Right. Because we understand it's one thing to get the concepts in your head, but it's quite another thing to build the muscles of actually doing it. So we're both teachers. We love to teach. And I've always thought my main gift to students is to give them the ability to bump into these things in their own experience, not just have it head knowledge, but have experiential knowledge. And so we're designing exercises for you to use so that you can bump into your own experience, and you can make these tools your own and not just learn the ideas from us.
And that way we'll be obsolete.
And that way we'll be obsolete.
You'll have it, and then you'll pass it on. But that will be how we've been of benefit. And then how you will then in turn be of benefit. Because then you'll use these same concepts and tools with all your relationships. These aren't just your, spousal relationships or partner relationships. These are relationships with friends, with kids, with family, with coworkers. And the more you use them, the more you're creating those grooves, you're creating new habits, you're creating new ways of perceiving, you're creating new ways of interacting, you're creating a different story for your life. And just like we're excited to share and be of benefit and say, hey,
this works.
This works. And we're somebody who, we're people who've really been kind of thinking about these things all our lives, and engaged in why and how to do it better, and so this is sort of us feeling like we're giving back as well to all the teachers and all the people who've helped us and led us, and really bring it to you so that then you can pass on, utilize, and use.
Right. So here's the course: stop having that same old fight and get what you really want instead. It's 8 weeks of live seminars. So that means there's a hard starting date, which is October 19th at 1 p.m. this time, Thursday at 1. We're going to keep this going. Now, it's great if you can join live, then you can ask questions in the Q&A there. But it's also going to be recorded. So if that's not a convenient time for you, you can always watch it later. And you can, in the communication, you can put in questions after the live session that we'll read, and then we'll answer in the next live session the week later. So it's 8 weeks. Starting October 19th, you're thinking, what about Thanksgiving? Yeah, we're not going to do it on Thanksgiving.
No.
We're going to skip that week.
You can go and do
There'll be lots of chance to practice.
Hey, use your newfound tools, and then bring back your findings.
So I believe it ends, the last Thursday is December 14th. So you can get it in this fall and maybe not polish. You can learn some skills and start to practice them. And over the holidays, as we've been saying, there's lots of chance to do them.
Practice.
So we're going to include an illustrated e-workbook with fillable forms. That's what Greta was talking about, that you'll actually be able to use them over and over and type in your responses so that you can think and process and share if the other person is doing this too.
Which
share
is
with them.
useful.
Yeah, right. We'd recommend that. But it's a good record for you of your own growth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we're offering this for what seems to us a really great price.
Yes.
8 sessions, like group sessions in therapy. It's going to be a limited number of individuals or couples. And so we're making it available to you for $247. But for today, we really, this is our first webinar, and we're really excited about that you've come, and we want to honor that. So we're offering a coupon today that you can use that takes the price down $50. So for $197, seems like a great deal. We have lots to share. And if you're interested, I think it's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So you may have learned already something about us, that we like kind of long titles. Stop having that same old fight and get what you really want instead. That's kind of the name of the course. What do we call our school? Practical Guides to Being Human. So when you look at the URL for all of that, it's huge.
Yes.
So here it is. I'm going to type it into the chat in a minute. So you can go and look at the course. We have a video on that you can watch that gives you much more detail about each module in the course. And the coupon is going to be good until the end of the day tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So if you would like to use that, go right ahead. Okay, so I think we're ready, Gretta, for the next.
The truth.
This is the third way to stop a toxic fight.
Right. Because one of the things that really, really gets it going is when we're fighting about the truth, right? And that can take many forms. It can be the truth of what happened, like the truth of what somebody said, or it can be the truth of who was there or when it was. I mean, you can be fighting about the truth in terms of the sort of actual what happened, but there probably wasn't a videotape going. And it really, letting go of that, even though you're so certain and it feels so important to like establish that what your memory of it is, of the event was the right memory, the true memory, to just kind of let it go and say, well, isn't that interesting that you're remembering that quite differently than I'm remembering that. Right. So that's one way, is sort of like letting go of that. And then the other thing is the truth about the meaning of what it means. That when you did this, the truth is that this is what it means. And not only is that the truth of what it means, but it's the truth of who you are. It's the truth of what you're thinking. It's the truth of what you're always thinking, what you're always doing. And when you start feeling that sense of the truth, it's always and never, and if I took a poll of the entire world, way more people would agree with me than they would agree with you, because it's so obvious that I'm right.
Sometimes what we say is, God and everybody else would agree with me.
Yes. And they would.
That's how it feels.
Yes.
So you can tell when you're in that mindset that I own the truth when you use the terms always and never. That sound familiar?
Right and wrong.
Right and wrong, good and bad, those judgmental terms come out when we're talking about the truth. So let's go back to our example.
Right.
So what it started out as was, Montreal is a fine place to get Indian food, right? That's the truth. I believe that, and God and everybody else would agree with me, including all the Montrealers, that Indian food in Montreal can be to die for.
Right. Except what I think, is that if you're going to be in Montreal for one day, then obviously you're going to have French food, because that's what you do when you're in a place that speaks French and French signs and has French food and is like mini Paris, right? So that obviously you would get French food, and everybody would agree with me.
As well as God.
Probably.
Right.
I don't know.
So here we are. Okay, I'm going to take this off.
Yes.
Here we are battling it out over the truth of getting Indian food is fine, getting French food is the only thing you could reasonably do. That's where it starts off. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. The truth. And then it devolves into these sticky beliefs we were talking about earlier, that you're being dismissive.
Right. And sarcastic.
And you're being dismissive and sarcastic. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. You are being controlling, and you're not allowing my input.
Right. You never let me have, you don't like let me have my, if I disagree with you, you're just going to get mad.
Right. You're too sensitive. You're going to get mad.
Yes.
What's the truth of that? Yes, you are. No, you're not. Yes, you are. No, you're not.
And then you go about the truth of what, but when you said that, but I didn't say that. I didn't say no. I said why, So then you start fighting about what actually started the fight. Yeah. And then that was another thing of the truth, right?
Yeah. So this probably, not the specifics of this fight, but something like it probably rings a bell with you, where you get entrenched in a belief and that you're not willing to give an inch, especially in an activated state.
It feels life and death. It feels like, oh, this is just, it's like always. And if I don't defend myself now, then I'm just allowing myself to be just run over, and I have no control. I have no power. I'm just this helpless victim, and it's not fair.
Right. So that's how that leads to fighting. And it gets more and more to be judgmental about each other and who each other are. So what's the way out of that? We say, give up fighting about the truth. To say, who's going to be the first one to say, oh yeah, you know what we're doing? We're fighting about the truth.
Right.
Okay, you can acknowledge that, but what's the alternative? There's a really important alternative. And that is, instead of fighting about the truth that God and everybody else would agree with, you can start sharing your experience.
Remember those different movies that we're in? That's what it's about, right? Instead of saying, this is the truth of the movie, and everybody would agree that there's one reality, and it's the reality that is my reality, right? And it's like, my reality is the reality. Right. And that's why it's really important to remember that whole concept of everyone's in their own movie, because then you go, wow, instead of fighting about truth, you go, wow, you're in a really different movie. Tell me more about your movie and what is going on in my movie. And when you start actually talking about what each other is experiencing and having sort of honest dialogue and vulnerable and kind of including some of your feelings and some of your, places of past hurts and stuff like that, then it's a communication. Then there's a way in which you're both understanding more, and that sets you up for being able to sort of say, well, okay, so what are we going to do now, right? We're not fighting about the truth anymore, because we know, whoa, we got really different realities. Right. But let's now that we sort of understand how each other's experiencing this, let's think about, well, what do we do, right? I mean, are we going to Indian? Are we going to French? Sort of like finding our way that feels like both people are included. And, you felt validated because I was saying, I really appreciated how much you were driving through that horrible rain. I wouldn't have wanted to do that. And I get that my reaction was maybe a bit big and could have felt like a sort of like, wah!
Yeah, but as soon as I understood some of the dynamics behind it and why it was meaningful, and kind of let go of having to be right, then it made more sense. Then I interpreted the action differently. Instead of interpreting it as stubborn and dismissive, I could interpret it as lots of longing and having hopes built up and then suddenly dashed.
Right.
So then that reaction made a lot more sense in that context, and then didn't have the same, I didn't have the same reaction inside of me.
Right. And I
So,
took myself out of being kind of sorry for myself and poor me and I I can't I can't say anything without you getting angry and
right.
sensitive, and started going, wow, let me think about what it's like for you and what you were experiencing, and being able to be curious about the other person's experience kind of opens our heart and lets us kind of be in that intimate, vulnerable place.
Yeah.
So actually we ended up having a really lovely romantic time that
Yeah.
felt very close, because we'd been able to do it differently. We'd been able to actually kind of go, do we really want to go into this? I mean, we're having a vacation. We don't want to have it all spoiled with this. And
Right.
instead we're in Montreal. We can have this great fun food. So we ended up having a lovely, romantic evening, because we were vulnerable and we were sort of open to hearing each other's movies.
Okay. So how are you going to go ahead and make use of this?
Right.
Well, we hope that this was inspiring or encouraging at least. But what we are going to send you as a thank you for attending our webinar is a PDF that we created for this very webinar, 3 ways to stop a toxic fight before it starts. And what it includes is a little more concise, in more concise language, the things we've been talking about, so that you can go back and read it at your leisure and think about some of these concepts and try them on. And it has our whole Montreal experience in black and white here. And then it also, it's another fillable PDF where you can look at the questions and type in your own answers. So you can reflect on a conflict that you've had and take it apart in these 3 ways. What was the movie I was in? What was the movie the other person was in? What was the action that got me going? How did I interpret it? And what was behind that? What were my sticky beliefs? And thirdly, what was the truth that I was fighting about?
Mm-hmm.
And what then is, instead of demanding that it be acknowledged as true and that God and everybody else would agree with me, instead transform it into, let me share with you my experience and all I've learned about what it means. And that is a truth that nobody can argue with, your own internal experience.
So one of the questions that often gets asked is sort of like, but what happens when one of the people just says, no, this is what happened, and sort of feels very, very, very kind of like set and rigid in, but this is what happens. The other person can still say, I can acknowledge that, that's really how you're remembering it, and that it feels really important to you, that's what happened. And I'm saying, well, if that's how you remember it, and if
Right.
that's how you interpret it, then it makes sense that you would have that reaction. So in a way, you're not kind of like, you're not giving it up that, yes, I agree that that's what happened and that's the only way to interpret it. But you're really, and in a heartfelt way,
Yeah.
kind of understanding that person who was just so locked into it, that they're stuck right there in that, this is what happened and this is what it means. And kind of being able to sort of just say, okay, I understand that that's what it means for you, and not necessarily what it means for me. But then even kind of going then to, so what would be a behavior, right? I mean, you can even just sort of say, well, what are we doing? Okay. That's how you're seeing it. That's how you're interpreting it. I'm understanding that, but sort of drop down into, so I'm curious, how do you want to proceed?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of one of the big questions that comes up if both people aren't sort of equally engaged in sort of letting go of kind of the truth, or being convinced that their movie is the only movie, and that how could there be any other movie,
Mm-hmm.
any other interpretation, or another truth? And that we talk about that with course and things like that, about different ways to really work with situations that are not quite as open to doing the work that we are.
Yeah.
You know? So that's one of the big questions that comes up.
So we're interested in hearing questions from you. I'm going to check in the chat. So type questions into the chat, and we'll take a few minutes to answer any questions that you may have.
Right, because we understand that the way this will actually become a usable concept and usable tools is for you to try them out, and then sometimes it's like, yeah, but this didn't work the way you say it's going to work. And so it's like, well, let's take it apart. Let's be curious about it. Let's think about, well, maybe there was a slightly different way that you were understanding the concept, because we're just using words, and words are very imperfect. So understanding that's something to really sort of get at the tools and concepts in a way that's going to work for you, and then being able to sort of say, I'm understanding that I'm okay when it's in one range, but when we're talking about something that has to do with my child, then I just see red. It's just like, forget it. It's like, if it's about something that feels like it involves the safety of my child, then I'm really not able to consider any other reality or interpretation or truth, because my instinct as a parent gets me going. And so that's sort of one of the things to think about. Did you find questions?
I have there's a great question came in. I just want to let you know that I typed into the chat both the URL for the course, if you want to just check that out or enroll, and also the coupon code for today. That's good for $50 off today and tomorrow. So here's a great question. How do you overcome the initial activation long enough to call for a pause? That is a very good question. And here's a beginning answer to that. That become more skilled at recognizing when activation starts. Often we aren't tuned in to the very strong telltale signals of an activation, which usually starts with physical qualities, whether your shoulders tighten, some kind of muscle tension, and this feeling, the instinctive reactions to threat are fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, we say. So that if you start realizing you're getting ready to either enter the fray or get out of here or shut down or
placate.
That's the fawning. Then you're beginning to get activated. It's like a truck. I think of this, a truck that has lost its brakes, right? It's kind of just cresting the top of a hill. When's the time you want to stop it? Near the top of the hill, rather than when it starts zooming down. So
but you can take those little
right.
What are they called?
They call them
emergency driveways.
Right. There's lots of sand there.
Yes.
So your truck goes up one of those. But catching activation early is helpful.
And also, and one of the things that we'll really go over in the course in depth is to sort of understand the conditions, right? So that's another thing, right? So like being able to go, wow, we're both really tired and we're really hungry, right. And we're also, our nerves are a bit tense. And so, kind of like being aware of those things also helps, just kind of generally being mindful of where we are and communicating it to the other person.
Yeah.
So even saying, I am feeling really sensitive right now. I'm
Yeah.
kind of off. So let's like be careful about how we're talking.
Yeah. So those are some suggestions for getting it in the beginning stages, but say you're really in it.
Like flash. Ah!
Right. Then you can then you just say, I can't do this anymore. What I have done with myself as I was learning to control this more and more was to say that I can't do this, and then to stop and say, okay, what do I do next? I don't even know what. Oh, pause. Oh yeah, pause.
Right.
We need to take a pause. So catching yourself before you're ready to deliver that blow or shut down or
say the thing you don't want to say.
Right. Say, we have to stop. We have to stop doing this. Let's take a pause. And then when you're taking a pause, then you can start to think about all this stuff.
Well, but an important thing to realize is that even if you're actually, you've jumped on the train of activation and you're like heading in a direction, then that you can always get off, right? So you could have even gone pretty far into the fight, maybe 20 minutes or something like that, and it's like getting ugly. Is you can always jump off that train and say, hey, I'm jumping off that train and I'm waiting on the station and I'm turning around and coming back. Just to kind of understand and to not blame yourself or blame the other person. You're just being human. It's like, and understanding that at any point that you capture it and turn it around, even if it's an hour later, and start kind of saying, what was that? That whenever you start doing this work, that builds the muscle that's going to eventually change it. So
that's very helpful.
You keep working at it. You don't feel discouraged. It's not like, oh, well, we failed, we had a fight. It's like, okay, so what did you learn from it?
We heard a good TED Talk driving up here last night about the use of failure.
Yes.
And to be able to face without fear into things that feel like failure in communication, and then to look at it and what could be done better. So that was helpful. There's two more really great questions.
Okay.
One is, how do we decide to get French food instead of Indian? Did it end up feeling like one of us lost and the other won?
Well, I was very grateful that we got French food. So that's probably a question for you.
Yeah. Well, in the PDF that we're going to be sending you, we actually talk about that there are two ways to work with that. One is it feels more useful for the relationship to use the suggestion of one person, which was that case in that evening where I saw, it means much more to her to have this experience in a French restaurant. For me, it was just a matter of convenience. So that was not, once we got over fighting about the truth of whether it was a stupid idea to get Indian food or not, then it was easy for me to say, of course, let's go get French food because it means a lot to you and I would enjoy that just fine.
But we could have said, well, let's have a compromise where we got French Indian food.
That's the other way. Right. Vietnamese.
Yeah, maybe, it's like French, but Asian.
So the other way to do it is to compromise, to say, okay, let's each move a little bit so that it doesn't feel like somebody is just winning. We can find a middle road. So those are two ways that we think of to answer that question. And here's a third one. Sounds like this could work for political discussions too.
Yes.
But how do you get past facts which are dismissed? Not exactly the truth as you explain. Yeah, well, it is really hard when the reality of situations is not accepted. I mean, that's why this is a troubling time with fake news being felt all around. But what it still takes us back to is this possibility of dialogue.
Yes.
And it has always been in political movements in South Africa and in India and in the civil rights movement. the opportunity to get together with people and not fight about the truth, but to talk about personal experience, how I've experienced it in a vulnerable way. And that to us feels like one of the hopes that remains.
Right. And so, but being able to understand the beliefs. So if one person believes that this is going to be what's going to change the country, and another person believes that this is what's going to change the country, to just actually acknowledge, I'm interested in what you believe, right? And here's what I believe, and try to get a dialogue about not what is right, but that what we believe is right, and to kind of acknowledge that there are beliefs and they're shaped by all kinds of experience. And but that also being able to share what was hard is really important. And that's like reconciliation, what they did in South Africa, and things like that, where they would have both sides just tell their stories about what was hard, right? And just hear it, just witness, and just being there, not having to judge it or what was right or what was wrong or what happened or what didn't happen, just being with the other person.
Yeah.
So we've been with you.
Yeah. So it's been a lot of fun. We really appreciate the interaction. That really feels very lively for us. And it's so much of what we want to do is to be able to share just the little bits that we've learned. You know, we've made a point. We call it the book that Greta's been working on. We call it A Practical Guide to Being Human.
Right.
Because it's not the practical guide. We're not claiming the truth about these concepts.
No.
We're just saying, here are some things that have worked for us. First of all, in our own relationship, and then with couples and individuals over years of intensive therapy work. We found
our own, as well as working with other couples.
Right. That these are things that work.
Yes.
And so we're passing them on to you. We hope you've enjoyed that today. We're sending you the ebook that has fillable forms. We hope you find that useful. And we hope you'll check out the course, because that's our next big endeavor in trying to disseminate the things that have meant so much to us.
Yes.
Okay. Any last words from you? Okay, maybe I get the last word today. So thanks for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again soon.